Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tommy Boland. I'm the Agricultural Science Association past president, and you're very welcome to the second in our webinar series of Future Farming, How is Irish Agriculture Responding? I think we've got a really timely and topical webinar organised today with two expert speakers. In today's webinar, the speakers include Dr. Pat Tuohy from Teagasc and Fergus Moore, a Senior Inspector at the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. Pat will discuss the drainage status of peatlands, grassland peat soils in Ireland and the issue of water table management on such soils. And a little bit later, Fergus will address national policy from the perspective of annual afforestation rates, target land covers, and preferred species mix. In terms of how today's webinar is going to proceed, we will hear from Dr. Tuohy first. Pat will deliver his presentation, and then we'll move straight into Fergus' presentation after that. So both presentations will be approximately 20 minutes in duration. I would just like to highlight to you all as well that we have the Q&A function available on today's webinar. So please type your questions into the Q&A function, and then I can see them and put them to our speakers. The questions will be put to our speakers at the end of the second presentation. So, we've got great experts on the line here today, so please take this opportunity to ask the questions. The webinar is also being recorded, so the recording will be up on the ASA website before the end of the week. In the Agricultural Science Association, we're focused on bringing the most up-to-date information to our members and to the wider agriculture and agri-food sector, and today's webinar certainly fits into that space. Earlier this week, the EU Parliament voted on setting up a system to quantify, monitor and verify carbon renewals. And the department has just recently closed a consultation on the carbon farming framework in Ireland. So everything we're going to hear today is certainly very timely. So at this point, I would like to introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Pat Tuohy, based in Teagasc Moore Park, leads a number of research projects focused on soil hydrology, land use and management, and the downstream impacts of same. Also has a role with soil carbon storage and wastewater management. He currently leads the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine funded RSF rewet project, which aims to assess the suitability of grassland peat soils for rewetting and to quantify associated impacts, and is working with other stakeholders to refine and reduce emissions from agricultural peat soils. So Pat, at this stage, I will pass over to yourself. I will ask you to share your screen, and I very much look forward to your presentation.
No problem, Tommy. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'll share this screen, and hopefully if there's... Are you seeing that now, yeah?
Yeah, have that, Pat.
Super. Okay. So look, I'll cut straight into it. As been introduced, I'm covering the general topic of grassland peat soils. It's a very topical issue at the moment. My slides aren't moving now here. 1 second. It's a very topical issue at the moment, and I suppose this slide, which I presented elsewhere before, some of you may have seen, but it just captures, I think, the reasons why, or should illustrate the reasons why grassland peat soils are such a hot topic. This is the LULUCF, the land use, change and forestry categories as itemized in the inventory, with a slight adjustment in that I've split the grassland, which I've highlighted there in red, into two, and you'll see in a moment why I've done that. They're usually reported together. But this is a league table effectively, so with the highest emissions there in the column on the right-hand side, ranked in order of the emissions. So you'll see the grassland peat soils, there's 335,000 hectares of those, emitting an estimated 9 million tonnes as currently estimated. Going down fairly rapidly through the figures, the next highest figure is the wetland category, which is emitting just over 2 million tonnes, all the way down to the grassland mineral soils, which are 3.8 million hectares, sequestering, or you'll see a minus figure there, sequestering 2 million tonnes. So the net figure for grasslands is currently 7, 9 minus 2, obviously. The total emissions from the LULUCF sector is just over 7, and you can see obviously the 9 is the big number in that table. So obviously trying to reduce that or refine that is a big part of our efforts to try and reduce that land use category. This is a separate, this is reportedly separately to the agriculture figure. Target, as you know, for the agriculture sector is 25% reduction, moving down from the total of 22 to 23 million tonnes as it is currently. This is reported separately currently, but there is plans afoot, I suppose, at an EU level and international level that agriculture and land use would be reported together. And I suppose that what's pushing that is, generally speaking, we're an outlier in this category in that most EU countries, or a lot of countries internationally, are reporting a net minus figure here, a net sequestration figure here, whereas ours is obviously positive at 7.25. So combining agriculture with land use makes a lot of sense in that you can balance the books, and some of the sequestration can dampen down the agricultural emissions, whereas in our case, that will amplify the number will be getting bigger, obviously. So that's just important to say as well. Current reporting and maybe future plans on how this is going to be reported. I've just highlighted the 9 million figure there. That 9 million figure, though, is highly uncertain, is how I defined it. All the elements there on that figure on the left-hand side are subject to ongoing research, a lot of which I am tied in with, or other colleagues or in other research institutes are tied in with. The extent of the peat is subject to uncertainty, what land use it's under, what the drainage status actually is at any given time, what the nutrient status is, and then associated emission factors. So every spoke in that wheel effectively is subject to change and subject to ongoing research in terms of how that 9 million figure is derived. The real nuts and bolts in it, if you look through the inventory, under that heading, the area of grassland peats is, as I said, 335,000 hectares in the inventory. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, dictates if water table level on those soils is unknown, we must assume that they are deep drained. And the associated emission factor, the rate of carbon equivalent emissions is about 26 tonnes per hectare in that category. So if you multiply the 26 by the 335 figure, you get close to the 9 million fairly quick. So that's where the estimate is coming from, largely speaking. Earlier this year, and I suppose an ongoing work for the last probably 2 years at this stage, I suppose we are trying to throw a bit of a spanner in the works in that we don't believe the drainage status should be considered, or the water table level, which is equivalent to the drainage status, should be considered as unknown. And we published this paper in June of this year, which is looking at that question of what the drainage status actually is and what the impact of that would be in terms of this question of the total emissions estimate. We've drawn up alternative scenarios that are reducing that 9 million figure effectively by half or more if the drainage status is adjusted accordingly, because effectively the assumption as it is, as I said, if the water table level is unknown, that they're all deep drained, is hard to justify in terms of the level of investment and the level of maintenance that would require across, you know, a very large area in terms of the 335,000 hectares. So we presented that, and we followed up that with a number of meetings in terms of dealings with the EPA and other stakeholders, and they're looking at including those changes in future inventory updates. So that number of the 9 million figure is likely to come down, but if we were to look at that figure coming down even drastically, it's still a very high number, you know. So if it goes from 9 to 4, 5, 6 million, it's still a very high number. It's much less than it was, but it's still a very large number and a very high emission from that land use. How we tackle that? So that's, I suppose, covering the general reason why this is a hot topic, and I suppose some of the refinements that might be coming. But I suppose, as I said, whether we refine it or not, it's still going to be a very large number. So there's a question there in terms of how do we try and reduce that number, and what the role of water table control or land drainage or rewetting is in the whole emissions question. There's a number of references shown there, both coming from our own, the MAC grouping, the Teagasc abatement cost curve, various different climate reports, the climate action plan from 2019, the more recent climate action plan from 2023. The role of land drainage, water table control is quite front and center in that. What it boils down to really is two separate, or splitting soils into two separate categories. And to simplify it, that in terms of mineral soils, wet mineral soils, there's a benefit in terms of reducing nitrous oxide emissions and providing for extended grazing in draining those. So there's a positive in terms of investing in drainage in those. Outside of any on-farm benefits in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions question. And the other category then, as I have it there in the red text, water table manipulation of the organic soils, which is referred to more often than not, particularly in the media, as rewetting. So two very different approaches for two very different soils. The 2023 Climate Action Plan, which was published Christmas week of 2022, has those targets in black and white, as you're seeing there. 25,000 hectares of drained organic soils are to have reduced management intensity by 2025, 80,000 by 2030. And when you look at the fine print, reduced management intensity means water table management, means rewetting. So the terminology in this can get a bit vague or less vague depending on which part of the small print you're reading, but that's effectively what that target is suggesting or is proposing. Just interesting to note, I suppose, when we look at the Climate Action Plan and the Nature Restoration Law, I suppose they in a lot of aspects marry up well together in terms of the climate question, the biodiversity questions. In this area, it's hard to maybe see at times where they marry up, because what I've highlighted there in the figure is the 2030 and 2050 targets for the Climate Action Plan, the most recent one, and the Nature Restoration Law. They both refer to the category we're talking about. They're called drained organic soils in the Climate Action Plan. They're called organic soils in agricultural use in the Nature Restoration Law text. You see the percentages there that are targeted for rewetting in 2030 in the green. The NRL, the Nature Restoration Law there in the middle, we can largely forget about, because that has been changed now with the latest changes, what has been voted through or what is moving through at commission level at the moment. But even if we compare the 2030 targets for the Climate Action Plan, the 80,000 hectares is approximately 25% of the 335,000 total area targeted to be rewetted by 2030. The Nature Restoration Law targets 7.5% of the total area by 2030 and 16.66% by 2050. So the actual proposals in terms of rewetting or water table management on these soils is much more ambitious. Excuse me, is much more ambitious in the short term in the Climate Action Plan than it is in the Nature Restoration Law. So it's just to highlight that. What the Nature Restoration Law also has is what they call the targets for restoring these soils, which are higher levels. So 30% they're easy to remember because it's 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. So that's something just to bear in mind. The two different categories, just to revert back, mineral soils, these are soils that are derived from mineral matter, aka sand, silt, and clay in larger particles. Little organic matter, generally less than 10%, and they would look like generally the soil profiles you're looking at there. So these are, fairly common, very common around the country, not something that should be unseen before by most of you listening, but it's just to rehash what we're talking about. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the drainage of wet mineral soils is positive and is encouraged in all the documents that I've been mentioning. But this is a totally different kettle of fish when it comes to the organic soil. So what are they again? The picture should tell a certain story. The definition is that the peats possess an organic layer that has at least 20% organic carbon and a minimum thickness of 40 centimeters. Histic soils, slightly different definition. It's drained peat soils effectively, so the thickness can be a bit less because it's reduced. But again, high levels of organic content, organic carbon content. So those are the two categories and the two different prescriptions, I suppose, of what should be done with those from an emission point of view. We look at those from the soil information system. We have approximately at that level similar amounts of those two categories. In terms of millions of hectares there on the left, 1.5 million hectares of imperfectly and poorly drained mineral soils, which are suitable to drainage and beneficial in terms of emissions for drainage, and about 1.6, 1.7 million of the organic category, of which we're not responsible from an agricultural context of all of that. We're only responsible for a portion of that, which is the approximate 350,000 figure that I've been mentioning. So that's what we're dealing with in general terms. There's also this, and it's to further confuse things maybe, or put the cat among the pigeons a bit more, but there is this halfway house, or this kind of transition between the two, I suppose, effectively. For the purposes of the mitigation measures I've highlighted, their soils are all categorized, or the prescriptions are dictated on whether it's a mineral or organic, but there's very little said on this category, which there's about 600,000 hectares of under grassland in the country. High organic soils, and I suppose there's a question there on how those are going to be managed, because there is no current prescription in how those are going to be managed. What those are, again, the photographs will tell you there, they're basically largely mineral soils with an organic topsoil or organic layer at the top. So they're high carbon content, but they're not deep enough or significant enough to be classed as a peat, but there is a lot of organic matter in play, I suppose, in those soils. The other categories I highlighted, where agriculture is responsible for 350,000 approximately hectares of the total peatland area. The rest of it is made up of the other categories, as you see there, and there's further characterization required for those to break down or to shift maybe between those numbers. But generally speaking, those are the kind of areas we're talking about in terms of the different categories, or the different use categories, I suppose. In terms of a typical farm, I suppose it's worth asking the question, where do we sit in terms of a breakdown between those different categories and the different management that might be prescribed for those going forward. This is a study that was published in early 2021 that I was tied in with, and it looked at carbon storage and carbon stocks on 10 farms across the country. There's pictures there again showing some of the profiles were dug. There's a graphic on the bottom left which shows where the organic carbon was stored in the different horizons, just to highlight the scales on those two different. The one on the bottom left showing the A, B, and C horizons is at a different scale, as you'll note, than the O horizon, which is an organic horizon, which, as you would expect, is a much higher proportion of organic matter. But again, where this stuff was, where it was stored, at what depth, what different soil types. The pie chart, I suppose, is the take-home message really for me to a degree. On those 10 farms you were seeing, and these are generally heavy soiled farms, they're dairy farms or grassland farms. 71% on average was mineral, 8% on average was organic, and 21% was in that limbo zone, that transition zone, humic. But you can see generally what may be dealt with on a typical farm, and as I said, there'll be different approaches going forward to those different soils. The total number highlighted on the bottom right, and sorry now I'm jumping around this slide a bit, but 350 tonnes per hectare was what was recorded in terms of the carbon stored across those farms. So significant amounts of carbon, and you'd see similar figures being reported again from various grassland soils around the country in different reports. The rewet project was mentioned. This is just to highlight it again. Department of Agriculture funded, links in with various EIPs which are looking at peatland, or looking at peats, grassland peats, rewetting up in the Midlands and in the Southwest. There's 13 sites now on the program. You can see them there highlighted on the Google Maps image there. The red dot there in both those cases in the circles is indicating the farm yard, and the blue dot is indicating the field sites. You can see very clearly they're on the fringes of larger peatland, grasslands on the fringes of larger peatland areas. And there's questions there in terms of what is the current drainage status, and if we are manipulating or moving the water table, how do we do that? Where's the best point of attack, what the cost would be, and ultimately what the impact would be on the land in question and any adjacent land. You can see there more images of sites. There's lots of colourful dots there, but those are basically monitoring points, be it for peat depthing, soil sampling, water table monitoring, soil moisture monitoring. So they're very heavily monitored sites. There's a list there on the left showing everything that we're trying to monitor, or we are monitoring, and that data has been collected. The project is ongoing since about 18 months now, April of 22 until April of 26. So we have a lot of work done, and I suppose a lot more to do, and there will be interesting results coming from that project as it develops and as we start to pull that data down from all those monitoring stations and monitoring points. The last slide then, just to highlight, there's another proposal which has gone into the Department of Ag again, and we're waiting to get the final green light on this, called Detect, which is looking at drainage status, the mapping of drainage status on organic rich or peat soils to try and support as best we can in terms of the NIR, the National Inventory reporting, and various other policy needs of various different stakeholders. Looking at the questions I mentioned in the first or second slide, trying to quantify better numbers in terms of the extent of peat under agriculture and its drainage status, aiming to further refine the emissions estimates and obviously reduce total emissions simultaneously, and provide information for policy around the management of these soils at fairly large scales. So that's a whistle stop tour, I suppose, of what's going on and some of the work that's coming up. Yeah, that's my last slide. So I'm not sure, Tommy, if you want to, I think you're leaving questions to the end, but that's as much as I wanted to cover. Thank you.
That's excellent, Pat. Thanks very much. And yes, we will leave the questions to the end, and there are some questions coming through, and I'll just encourage the viewers, if you have questions for Pat or for Fergus on his upcoming presentation, to type them into the Q&A function there on your screen in front of you. And thanks very much, Pat, for that. I think it's really good overview of the current situation and some of the work that's ongoing to maybe shed some more light and some more clarity on that. At this point, we'll pass over to our second speaker, Fergus Moore. Fergus is Senior Inspector at the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and heads up the Forest Sector Development Division. He has assigned responsibilities which include the development of the forest sector, National Forest Inventory, forest genetic resources, and the contribution of forest to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Responsibilities also include EU and international engagements on foreign policy on behalf of the department. So, Fergus, really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today, reading that list of commitments and responsibilities. I'm amazed you have the time to join us, but I think it'll be really good for our viewers to get your insights here into Ireland's forest strategy. So I'll pass over to you now, Fergus.
That's great, Tommy. Thanks very much for that. Certainly, can you see all my slides there?
Yeah, they're not in presentation mode yet.
Okay, Fergus. 2 seconds here now. I'll try and get that in presentation mode. Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much for the invite. Really a pleasure to speak to you all today. What I'm going to try to do is just give you a very, I suppose, flavour of the sort of things that have been happening with ourselves in the last couple of years. And I suppose for some of you who don't really know much about forestry in Ireland in general, I'll give a very, very brief overview of where we are in relation to the forest sector, a little bit about the National Forest Inventory in relation to our species composition, and about our forest strategy that we've developed over the last 2 years, which really sets out the vision for forestry out to 2050. And again, that will be quite important, especially in relation to that whole discussion on peat and soils as well, that Pat alluded to there as well in this presentation in relation to forests and peats, which is obviously quite a I suppose a change in the inventory in relation to the results that we've measured over the last number of years. So in relation to forestry in Ireland, I suppose the first thing to say is that we have currently a very high-tech, innovative forest sector, which is very dynamic. It's got a lot of technology investment over the last, I suppose, 50, 60 years. We've got a very large forest estate, which has about 8 large sawmills and panelboard mills that process all the majority of the timber. 80% of the timber that's harvested in Ireland goes through these particular mills. And again, these mills are using the best available technology. A lot of it's come from Scandinavia, very high-tech harvesting machines. And again, you know, a lot of timber haulage, a lot of timber drying facilities. And again, you know, a lot of harvested wood products. And again, that links into that piece there that Pat showed there on the inventory, a lot of carbon stored in those harvested wood products, which is very important. I suppose some of the very high level forestry facts are we have 11.6% forest cover. And again, half that is found in the private estate and half roughly in the public estate. So again, Quilcha will be I suppose, the dominant player in relation to the public forests that are owned by the state. And again, we've probably established with our landowners, 24,000 forest landowners, have basically planted over 300,000 hectares of forest since 1989. So again, that's quite a considerable amount of public investment by the state and also in the farmers that actually use their lands. So I suppose getting back to it, what Pat was saying as well about the carbon sequestration impact, our forests are very young and they're basically sucking in about 2 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. That figure is actually dropping, and there's a few reasons for that, and we can discuss that later on. But basically, the forest sink is declining, and that's mainly down to the fact that we have an increase in harvesting that's taking place, and also we have a lot of forest and peat soils that are actually emitting a lot of carbon currently, and that's part of the challenge regarding this. The national inventory regarding the land use sector, the fact that the land use sector is actually a net source of carbon of 7 million tons plus, and that's obviously going to rise over the next number of years. So significant challenges there. About 10,000 people employed directly and indirectly in forestry. And in addition to that, we have our forest owners, 24,000. And again, they are doing a lot of work in those forests. So again, that employment figure is probably a lot higher if you take into account all the people that are working in the forest that we have today. The good news story is that all the forests that were planted back in the last 30 years are now sort of coming up to harvesting age. And we have about 4 million cubic meters of timber being harvested annually per year from the private and public estate. And that's set to rise to about 7 million cubic meters by about 2035. So it's going to generate loads and loads of opportunities for harvest wood products. And again, lots of income for forest landowners. And I suppose just give you a very high level view of the species composition of our national forest estate. Every 4 to 5 years, we carry out a national forest inventory of all the forests that we have in Ireland. We do a statistical sampling of about 2,000 plots. And basically from that survey, the latest figures that were published last year show that about half the estate is Sitka spruce, which is a very strong commercial species that's used for a whole range of harvested wood products, which is quite important. And again, we have Norway spruce and Scots pine, things like Douglas fir and larch, but we also have some broadleaves planted as well. Sessile oak, about 2.8%. Ash as well, obviously significantly impacts by ash tieback in the last number of years. And about 3.4% of our forest estate is ash. And again, quite a systematic sort of, I suppose, impact on ash by the ash tieback disease that took place over the last number of years, which is causing obviously serious impacts for forest owners. And certainly there's a lot of work going on internally within DAFM and an independent review there recently. And the minister will be bringing proposals and publishing proposals very shortly in relation to the findings of that particular report. So I suppose what we've done in the last number of years is we've developed a new forest strategy for Ireland based on a forestry vision. And we published a forestry vision in 2050. And again, this was based on about 3,500 submissions that we got from the members of the public. And also we did a public attitude survey of 1,000 people, again, which helped to inform this vision of the right trees in the right place for the right reasons with the right management, supporting a sustainable and thriving economy and society and a healthy environment. And I suppose you could say it's kind of a blue picture, a bit of a perfect world scenario of what we'd like to see in our landscape by 2050. We certainly would like to see a lot more forests being planted, more integrated with agriculture. And again, that farmers and foresters come together to see a greater mix of different land uses on particular farms. And again, using those forests to try and promote and drive on the circular economy, again, replacing things like concrete and steel and have a more sustainable, I suppose, society across all different land uses in the future. That's sort of our blue sky picture of what we'd like to see happen. And that was basically informed by extensive consultation, which took place over the last 18 months to 2 years. And I suppose based on that, we then formed a forest strategy. And that forest strategy focuses on 5 things. It focuses on the importance of forests for climate, importance of forests for wood, for people, for nature, and the economy. And again, this probably leads into other discussions on, forests are very important for carbon and carbon sequestration and carbon storage. The forests themselves suck in lots of carbon dioxide. They also emit carbon dioxide when they're harvested. But again, the carbon stored in the harvested wood products, again, is a very important lever in trying to, I suppose, permanently take out carbon out of the atmosphere and try to lock it up in timber products, which is important. Obviously, forest for nature, really important as well. And again, under the nature restoration law, we're going to see a lot of expansion of our forest woodland at scale if we get farmers to apply for our schemes to try and increase the level of broadleaf woodlands that we have in the country. As you know, we've got very few broadleaf forests in our country in relation to our native forests that need to be expanded. But it's also important to stress the point that, farmers, when they're planting forests, they need to have income as well. So it's important that we have a mix of commercial and non-commercial species to try and ensure that we have income for our farmers to try and drive on that sort of forest management that takes place. So again, part of the strategy is about trying to increase and take down some of the barriers associated with building in wood. So again, they're the 5 main pillars that we've basically come across. And with those 5 main pillars, we've developed a forest strategy, and it's available on our website to be downloaded. But associated with that forest strategy, there's over 87 different individual actions. And I know there's a lot of focus on afforestation, and that is one of the key drivers to try and, be one of our targets for our climate action plan, is to try and increase afforestation levels beyond the current 2,000 hectares that we've seen over the last number of years, to try and really increase that at scale over the coming years, over the next forestry program. But the forest strategy itself actually focuses on lots of other areas in addition to afforestation. It talks about, native forest expansion. It also talks about sustainable forest management. The existing forest estate that we have at the moment, as I say, we have 11.6% forest cover. We need to try and mobilize the timber that's from that particular forest resource, and also put in place measures to help with the sustainable forest management of those particular stands. And again, in our forestry program, we have a lot of supports there to try and help forest owners manage the forest in a more sustainable manner, and try to support them in the good work that they actually do. There's also lots of action there about carbon sequestration and storage. And again, looking at, exploring the opportunities for, a voluntary carbon code for Ireland. And again, that kind of feeds into some of the work that Pat talked about regarding that voluntary framework for the certification of removal of carbon right across the European Union. There's a lot of discussion at the moment in relation to how we would do that, and also the importance of measuring the embodied carbon that we have in harvested wood products. So, for example, when a building is being built, it's important that we try and look at the embodied carbon that building will actually store. And I suppose ask people to, to reflect on, if you use concrete and steel, that has a higher embodied carbon by using those non-sustainable products. So again, forest is really well placed in order to try and fill that particular gap to provide those harvested wood products. There's lots of other actions there about well-being and health and recreation, and also building trust and confidence in the sector, and building more and more forests that are resilient in the fight of climate change and forest health. All very, very important. But I suppose for some of your own members, you're probably dealing with farmers who are interested in afforestation. And I suppose under our new forestry program, there's been a few changes. And again, as you're probably aware in the media over the last, I suppose, 7, 8, 9 months, we've had a very protracted discussions with the European Union in relation to our new forestry program to try to get it across the line. And there's been a few changes we've had to impose on that program. And again, that reflects on the public consultation that we received, that people want to see more mixed forests being planted in the landscape, and a mix of both conifers and broadleaves. So we have a new target there to be applied nationally, which is that all new forests nationally will have about 50% broadleaf forests as part of their makeup. It's not a target we apply at every individual forest, but at a national level, we've committed to trying to achieve that 50% broadleaf target. And again, that's probably in line with the direction of travel over the last number of years, whereby we've seen about 40 to 45% or thereabouts of our forests being planted are actually broadleaves. So that's where that's coming from. Again, our afforestation target, we have a target of 8,000 hectares per year. And again, we are struggling to try and get to that target. We've only planted about 2,000 hectares over the last number of years. If you go back to 95, we had very, very high levels of afforestation, and it's been steadily declining over the last number of years. And there's lots of reasons for that. You know, the regulatory environment has been mentioned. Farmers, I suppose, lack of enthusiasm to carry out afforestation. But 8,000 hectares is our target. And again, we've I suppose, an ambition to reach 18% forest cover. Depending how much we plant will determine how fast we get to 18% forest cover. But certainly, if we get farmers engaging with forestry again, like they did in the past, we certainly would hope to see us getting to 8,000 hectares. And again, if we have more applications than 8,000 hectares, that's a good thing. And certainly from a budget perspective, we'll find the money to support a forestry program in excess of 8,000 hectares. The forestry program, as I said, was approved there back in September. And again, lots of different measures there. I won't go into all those in detail, but certainly it's on our website. We have a whole range of different schemes and supports to help and support farmers and foresters in their work in trying to basically expand our forests at scale. And we have a budget of about 1.3 billion euros, which is probably one of the largest budgets we've had to date in relation to any forestry program. As Pat mentioned there as well about the climate action plan, and again, this whole research on peat soils is very important. We've lots of very challenging targets to meet out to 2030 and also by 2050. And certainly forestry is going to play a significant play in relation to those particular targets. Mainly probably post 2050, because any forestry plants today, which are quite important, will probably sequester very little carbon dioxide between now and 2030. The fact that those forests are quite small. But it's important we get forests in the ground now, because obviously our 2050 targets are also very important. And forestry planted now will be significantly contributing to our 2050 targets. But again, significant challenges to take place there in relation to our land use review, which phase 2 has been completed, and we're now involved in phase 2 of that. And certainly phase 2 is looking at the challenges in relation to how we use our land for Ireland. And that's a difficult part regarding the policies in relation to how we manage our forests and also our land for Ireland. And again, the competing, I suppose, activities associated with that. Our LULUCF targets, again, we've got a LULUCF regulation that talks about, reducing our LULUCF emissions. And as Pat mentioned, we have over 7 million sort of tons of CO2 emitted based on our last inventory, and that's set to rise over the next number of years. So the direction of travel is in the wrong direction. And things like managing our forests and peat soils, looking at our harvesting rates, looking at planting more forests on mineral soils, all can have a significant part to play in basically reducing those emissions. And again, the more we build in wood and the more harvest wood products we use in the built environment, and again, that's going to try and certainly have a beneficial impact on the inventory as well over the coming years, which is quite important. And I suppose just to, for your members' perspective in relation to like what is the money in relation to particular applications or requests you get for people thinking about joining the afforestation schemes, I say the forest strategy is there. That's helped inform the forestry program, and we have a farm forestry booklet which is available to download from our website. That gives you all the details of all the grants and premium rates associated with the new forestry program. And again, lots of detail in relation to the scheme itself is available on our website. As regards the forestry program, we have a whole range of different measures. And again, we're trying to look at the whole aspect of how we manage our forests. So it's about putting in forests that are more mixed forests for the future to make them more resilient to climate change. And again, there's lots of opportunities there for environmental protection. Forests for water are also very important. And we have lots of grant rates and premiums associated with that as well. Things like continuous cover forestry is also quite important, but we also recognize that the clear fell is also a sustainable form of management for our commercial forests. And again, we're quite encouraged that, that what we're trying to do is trying to diversify the types of forest management systems we have in Ireland. When you look at the European continent, there's very little clear felling going on. It's a lot of continuous cover forestry, but again, they have a lot of native species. And again, that's the system that's evolved in those particular member states. Whereas in Ireland, we have this plantation forest system. And again, what we're trying to see is that we have a mix of different plantation types, whether it's commercial clear felling, whereas commercial, continuous cover forestry, or basically managing forests for nature. We have schemes here to support farmers in whatever way they choose to manage their forests, again within the overall picture of climate smart forestry and sustainable forest management. We also have very generous incentives for agroforestry, and again this is where you mix forests and grasslands on the same parcel of land. And again, I was at the agroforestry conference last week, and again, lots of interest there in relation to farmers considering agroforestry. In the last program, it was quite a low uptake, and we've increased the grant rates and premiums significantly in this particular program. So again, we're expecting a higher level of uptake than we currently had in the past. And again, for harvest wood products, we've done a lot of promotion. We're supporting a lot of I suppose, organizations in the promotion of forestry, harvest wood products, again, to try and ensure we develop those markets for our private forest owners. I won't go into all details in relation to the grants and premiums. They're up there on our website to look at, but just to give you some indication of the sort of money that's on offer for this program. If you planted 8 hectares of native forests, you would get about €8,800 in premium every year for 20 years tax-free. And the total drawdown in premiums is over €176,000, so quite significant amounts of money. A native tree area scheme, again, that's a scheme we have that you can apply for that without actually requiring a license, as long as you do it as part of a scheme, up to 1 hectare or 1 hectare along a riparian zone. And again, if you planted 1 hectare under a native tree area scheme, you get about €2,200 per hectare per year for 1 hectare. And again, that amounts to over €22,000 over the 10 years. And again, we received a lot of applications in the last number of weeks. And again, the turnaround time for getting approval for the native tree area scheme is about 3 weeks. So again, quite a good incentive for people who are only interested in planting a small bit of forests. I suppose regarding opportunities for diversification, and I suppose this is where the land use piece comes in, the land use review. I mean, from a landscape perspective, we want to see a very mixed landscape of mixed forests. We want to see forests grown for timber. We want to see forests grown for native biodiversity. We also want to see forests for water, but also agriculture is heavily in there as well. So hopefully what we're going to see is a very mixed landscape by 2050, a lot more than we currently have. And I say we have 11.6% forest cover. We certainly need to get that to 18% forest cover. So as soon as we get on that as quickly as possible, the better. And again, we have to try and engage as much as possible with the landowners who own the land, because obviously it's them who will be responsible, but they're the only ones that can deliver on these forestry targets. And again, the government is here to support them in those efforts. And just before I finish, really, regarding timber markets, you know, like it's important that we try to use as much timber as possible. And again, we're doing a lot of work in relation to the industry and the various stakeholders there to try to encourage more timber to be used in construction. And again, these are some, I suppose, showcase examples of significant amounts of timber that have been used in the past. You know, you've got Centre Parks there, you've got the new Quilcha Avondale site, demonstrating the use of glulam, you know, these innovative wood products that are coming on stream that are being used right across Europe, but also more traditional timber frame building. We see this is a major growth area. Last year, I think it's about 35–40% of the scheme houses that were built were timber frame. And you look to Scotland, it's about 70–80%. So again, there's really significant scope to try and increase the market share of timber being used in timber frame building in Ireland. And again, some of the work that's ongoing at the moment, you know, Coford produced a very good number of statements there recently on wood products, mitigation and climate change. And also the Housing for All strategy talks about putting 30,000 houses per year. Lots of opportunities to use more timber in those construction that take place. And again, modern methods of construction whereby, you know, the traditional way of building a house on site, that's moving away now to building houses in panels and factories and delivering it on site and basically having quicker turnaround times in how those houses are built. In response to this, you know, the Minister Hackett, with other departments, has set up a timber construction steering group that held its first meeting last couple of weeks. And again, there's 5 thematic areas they're going to examine in more detail: market opportunity for timber, regulation standards and compliance, public procurement and demonstration projects, more research and development and innovation, and also looking at the communications and the education and training and public awareness. And these are all important to try and ensure that our 24,000 forest owners that have planted forests, that is a good, vibrant market there to try and deliver and actually use more timber construction. And again, that's quite a positive initiative that's taking place. And again, we're hoping to try and break down some of the barriers that are currently there at the moment. That's all from me. Tommy, hopefully to take any questions after that. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Fergus. That's an excellent overview and a run through the current status of the forestry sector in Ireland, and also some of the initiatives and some of the incentives there to support afforestation. We have a few questions coming in, and I just asked the participants and the panelists and the attendees if you have any additional questions to put them into the chat box there as well. Maybe Fergus might start with one for yourself. Land cover in forestry is currently 11%. The target is to bring that to 18%. I suppose to quote the old saying, we're not making any more land. So has there been any analysis done of what sectors currently using land are most likely to contribute that land to the afforestation? Or has that analysis been undertaken?
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly there has been a lot of work done by COFORT in the past in looking at the whole land availability piece. So as you say, we're not making any more land. There's about 7 million hectares of land out there in the country. And to get 18%, you're looking at 450 or 500,000 hectares of additional land to plant with trees, which obviously is going to be competing strongly with other agricultural land use areas. Some of the reports that have been done have looked at what's the available, I suppose, land that could be planted. And I suppose there is a sense that the available marginal land is probably about 1.3 million hectares. That's mainly sheep and beef systems, where there's probably potential for some of that land to be planted without impacting on those overall, I suppose, systems. As you say, you know, I mean, land that's heavily involved in agriculture at the moment, in productive agriculture, yeah, it's going to be very difficult for farmers to plant that particular cohort of land. But certainly what we're looking at is that if farmers look at their farm holdings, there's certainly parts of their farm holdings that could be planted, you know, very wet areas of farms. And again, trees don't need top-class agricultural land. It is those wet marginal lands that can be planted. And I know there's a lot of restrictions in our new program in relation to peat soils. And again, when people look at past afforestation rates, it was a lot of forestry on peat soils, and we're not planting those now. And that's obviously another obstacle in sort of getting to those particular targets.
And just to maybe follow on that point very briefly, Fergus, you say we're not planting the peatlands now. Are there restrictions on planting on peatlands now, or can you just clarify the situation there?
Yeah, the situation there, Tommy, is that on our last programme, there was a lot of focus being placed on the forests and peat soils. And the fact that a significant proportion of those particular soils, I mean, I think currently the forests we have on peat soils are probably emitting about 2 to 3 million tonnes of carbon currently at the moment. So certainly the focus of the European Commission was don't add to the problem that you currently have. So it's really a case of not planting peat soils in the future. So the restrictions we have at the moment is that forests less than 30 centimetres of peat, we are planting, but anything over 30 centimetres of peat, we're not planting in the new programme. And the basis for that is that if you plant forests on peat soils, with the existing research we have, it shows that those forests will become a net emitter of carbon after the second or third rotation. And that's really the main game changer for us. And that's down to a lot of recent research that has shown that forests on peat are emitting far more carbon than we originally thought. So that's a major change to the land pool of land available for forestry.
And I suspect maybe for some of our viewers today, there might have been some surprises in the fact that our grasslands are a net source of carbon. Our forestry will likely become a net source of carbon over the next 10 years, and then that situation will revert as the new plantations mature. Why exactly are our forests going to tip into the situation where it'll become a source of carbon rather than a sink, Fergus?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a kind of an unusual question, because a lot of people think forests are always going to be a sequester of carbon, and they can't imagine that they could be actually a net source. We've been reporting a net sink for forestry carbon over the last 20, 30 years, but that'll change next year, that our national forest state will be a net source of carbon for the foreseeable future, out to 2050 and beyond. And the reasons for that are mainly due to the fact that the forests we planted 30 years ago are now coming up for harvesting. And when you harvest forests, all the brash decomposes, the soil gets exposed, and you get a lot of emissions of carbon dioxide when that takes place. We also have a large amount of forest, I say, on peat soils, and they are actually emitting significant amounts of carbon dioxide. But as you say, Tommy, if we continue to plant forests at scale, we could help reduce that impact. But certainly, due to the fact that our forests are coming of age and being harvested, so when I talk about our forests, our 4 million cubic meters is our annual harvest now, and that'll rise to 7 million cubic meters in the next 10, 15 years. That comes with a hit. The more harvesting, the more emissions you have. But again, we argue that a proportion of that emissions, when you put forests into harvested wood products, you help storing and locking up carbon. But certainly, our forests will be a net source of carbon from now on out to post 2050.
Okay, we might revisit that in a moment, Fergus. But Pat, I'll switch over to you there now. A couple of questions coming through for yourself. The whole talk about rewetting, maybe it strikes fear into the heart of farmers. Maybe water table management is a better term to use. When we manage the water table and some of those peat grasslands, what type of agriculture can be practiced afterwards?
Yeah, and that's, I suppose, the terminology. I suppose I meant to mention that earlier. I think I didn't. But in terms of the term rewetting, where that's largely been practiced within the country today, it has been on Bordemona and industrial peatlands, and they, for various reasons, to try and restore and allow for redevelopment of peat, they're actually bringing the water table up to above the surface. That's not what's envisaged for grassland soils. That the definition of rewetting is that you block drains and the water table moves closer to the surface subsequently. There's no diktat in terms of that it should be within X centimeters above or below the surface. So again, our experiences as a country has been a different type of rewetting, as I said, on the industrial peat. So it's maybe part of the reason people are a bit spooked or there's general issue. But look, regardless of that issue, there's a general, it doesn't sit well with people in terms of the efforts that have been put in over generations to drain these soils, and now that we should move the other way and we should be looking at what can be done. There is some work being done on various different, to answer your question directly, on various different issues in terms of what might be suitable, and it would be, to my mind, a shorter year in terms of a grazing scenario. So you'd have a longer winter effectively. So the mean water table position would be 20, 30, 40 centimeters closer to the surface, which means your summer is effectively shorter, your peak of your grazing season is effectively shorter. There is still potentially an element of, in dry summer conditions, having access to those areas. In other parts of the world, they've looked at what's called paludiculture and looked at growing different crops, on rewetted peat soils. It's at a different scale really than what we're talking about here in terms of the parcels will be relatively small on an individual farmer basis. So it's difficult to maybe see that at large scales. But there's a good bit of work has to be done in terms of part of the work that we're involved with in terms of what the impacts are and what the use cases might be then after the fact, and how much would be involved in terms of going from current status to a rewetted status. But all that, I think, is in the context of, and I talked about percentages being rewetted, being the climate action plan or the nature restoration law, Tommy. Like, percentages of the baseline really is the question. Where are we starting from? Yeah. There's recent work we've done to say what's assumed drain currently in the inventory and what we've been basing policy numbers on in terms of the 80,000 hectares figure are probably overestimated. So if that figure is refined, then your starting position, it's the case that a lot of soils are acting as rewetted already. So to go back to your first question, what will people do when these soils are rewetted? Well, they're already doing it. There's a degree of these soils out there that are currently technically rewetted. So the current management to the future management isn't going to be changing on those. It's the ones that are actively drained and effectively drained is where there'll be a more abrupt change, or a more significant change, I suppose, if the policy moves those into a rewetted status.
Maybe a simpler question, Pat, then, or it might not be. Why do drained peatlands emit carbon? What's happening there?
Yeah, so effectively what peat is, and the reason peat accumulates, so it's organic matter, it's dead animal and plant life and near surface biology that comes to the end of its lifetime, and it doesn't decompose because it's saturated. So some of you will be familiar with the examples of stuff that's preserved in the bogs, be that bog butter or even bog bodies, and bodies are body parts that were found and are on display in the various different museums. So the reason those are preserved is because they're in a saturated condition and they don't decompose, and the carbon held within is held and is stored. And similar to what Fergus said in terms of turning forestry into buildings, that carbon is still there, it's still held up. So when you dry and when you remove the water out of those soils, you introduce air into the system, and you introduce the facility or the capacity to decompose all that organic matter, and that releases carbon. So you get rid of you reduce the degree of saturation, and you change the conditions, and you bring about decomposition of anything that's stored, and that disappears into the air largely as carbon dioxide. So shifting the water table closer to the surface increases the amount of the peat that's saturated, and increases the amount of carbon that's stored because it's not decomposing, basically.
And maybe to follow on that, Pat, and have another question for Fergus then as well. In my experience, you put organic material in an anaerobic environment and you get methane produced. Is that an issue with wet soils, and how big of an issue is that?
Yeah, so there is an issue as you re-wet a peat soil. Methane, the level of methane that's emitted increases, but it's dwarfed by the savings in carbon. So there is no the balance is still favourable in terms of reducing emissions. Yeah,
perfect. Thanks, Pat. Fergus, a question has come through there on construction, and we have, I won't quite say we have an afforestation crisis in the country. Maybe we have a housing crisis, and lots of young people struggling to get onto the property ladder, and young people looking to build houses. Are there any incentives for timber frame construction for first-time buyers or first-time builders? And maybe it's an issue outside of the Department of Agriculture, but in terms of cross-departmental discussions that may be underway.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, Tommy, there is no incentives to purchase a timber frame house, but certainly from a cross-departmental perspective, we're trying to examine, I suppose, the regulations associated with the use of timber in buildings. So, for example, there is a lot of planning restrictions in how high you can build, I suppose, buildings in Ireland using timber. It's about 4 stories. So again, we have all the main players, all the departments, and a lot of the builders and architects are coming together in that timber construction working group to look at ways to try and see, can we remove the barriers to get more, I suppose, penetration of those particular markets. So yeah, I mean, on the timber frame side, yeah, I say in the Scotland, they're using significant amounts more homegrown timber in the houses they build. And ourselves in Ireland, we need to try and increase the level of timber in general that's used in construction. So certainly there is a lot of initiatives at the moment. There's one builder which is building one house in Ireland at the moment, 4 houses actually in a housing scheme, which is exclusively using Irish timber, all homegrown timber. And we plan to use that as a promotional a piece of work in the next number of months to try and show that, buildings with Irish homegrown timber is as good as imported timber, and also much better than using concrete and steel.
Yeah. Fergus, another question there when I have you. I suppose there's a very large ambition in terms of afforestation. The recent activity in that space would suggest that those targets may be challenging. There's a substantial budget underpinning that afforestation program at the moment. Are there any other measures that the department are undertaking to try and encourage that, or where do you see the kind of the big wins to be made there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly as I say, there's a lot of challenges there on regulation, even on our licensing side, and it's been highlighted a lot in the media. The sort of turnaround time on licenses has been quite long, and certainly in the department we've recruited about 30 additional ecologists to try and, I suppose, smooth that process on the licensing applications that go through our system. We're also hopefully today or tomorrow we'll be announcing I suppose a number of successful promotional calls, over €1 million of money where it's going to be I suppose awarding to individual contractors over the next number of days, and that's trying to promote the use of forestry right across Ireland. So again, lots of different organisations in addition to Teagasc will have access to a promotional fund that'll help try to encourage those farmers to try and work. And I know some of your members are involved in some promotion days recently around the country along with Teagasc and others, and certainly what I'd say is, try and be as positive as possible. There's a lot of money there. We won't achieve any target if we don't get farmers engaging. And I know there's lots of issues there in the department we're working through in conjunction with our stakeholders. And again, it's not perfect, but we're certainly working through some of the issues to try and iron out as many as we can possibly.
Perfect, Fergus. And Pat, I might just go back to you briefly with one final question perhaps, and I think this one fits into your barrow. In terms of our high carbon grasslands, some grasslands store more carbon than others. Are we approaching carbon saturation with some of those grasslands, or what is the capacity to continue to sequester carbon under some of our mineral grasslands, I guess, or some of our high carbon soils?
Yeah, there's additional scope there. So the high clay and high silt content soils in particular, they're not near their total potential, I suppose. There is a question around how we achieve that potential and how that might happen. Preventing losses, I suppose, is a more a priority area than trying to look at increasing any further gains in what's already there. It's holding what we have more so than in the short term, more so than building, because there's a lot of issues around how that might be done. There's a huge range out there. As I said, the figure from the paper that I quoted was 350 tons per hectare. So there's significant amounts already stored if we can just, and we are managing that currently, and that's there from live farms or from active farms, but it's just to look at how that's managed going forward to retain that as best we can is the priority really.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat. We're just 2 minutes past 2 o'clock now. I think I'll draw the questions to a close there now. Just maybe a huge amount of very valuable information presented by both Fergus and Pat, and I'd like to thank you both for your contributions and for the detail you went into in the time today. It's going to be very difficult to sum up. I think there's certainly a lot of work going on at the moment in terms of quantification and understanding what carbon we store in our various land use types, and particularly in our soils under grassland. So we need to quantify what's there, hold what we have, don't lose any more, and then look at building those carbon stores in our soils into the future. And then on the forestry side, quite a period of flux, I suggest, Fergus, in terms of the forestry situation nationally over the next 30 to 40 years, as we look at a shift from a carbon sink to a carbon source, and then with very ambitious afforestation and reforestation plans to increase the area. I think the figure you mentioned was 500,000 hectares more land going into forestry. That's a substantial challenge for the country as a whole, not just for the agricultural sector. And I think a point I always like to make in these discussions, this is not just an agricultural issue, it's not just an agricultural problem, it's an issue for Ireland as a whole, and it's something that Ireland as a whole will benefit from. So I'd just like to thank Pat and thank Fergus again for your time. I'd also like to thank Barbara McGoldrick for her organisation and coordination of the events in the background. Barbara's always there doing the hard work in the background that people don't see. And thanks to Niamh Bambrick as ASA president for putting the webinar together as an initiative. So, and finally, thanks to all our attendees today and for your questions. The recording will be up on the website tomorrow. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much all. Take care. Bye.